A sealed manila folder sat on a desk in Buenos Aires in the spring of 1960. Inside it, one photograph, a wartime SS portrait pulled from captured German files, and a handwritten note from a blind man who had never worked a day in intelligence. That folder was the only thing standing between the man who organized the murder of millions and another decade of quiet suburban life. The West German intelligence service already knew where he was. The CIA had known for years. They chose to do nothing. What came next was not the work of governments. It was the work of a 12-year-old girl, her father reading shadows from a room 300 miles away, and 11 people in a rented car on a dark street. How does the man who moved over 1.5 million people to their deaths disappear in plain sight for 15 years? Adolf Eichmann was not a killer in the way the word usually lands. He never shot anyone. He moved people the way a shipping company moves cargo: departure times, rail schedules, processing lines. When he arrived in Vienna in 1938, he designed a single office that stripped Jewish families of everything they owned, issued their forced travel papers, and pushed them out of Austria in sequence, under one roof. It was so efficient that Berlin told him to copy it in Prague the very next year. By 1941, he was running Jewish affairs for the entire Reich, with his own representatives stationed across occupied Europe, whose only job was to speed up the deportation trains when local governments slowed down. He read the murder statistics in real time from his desk in Berlin. He even wrote the postcards that prisoners were forced to sign, describing countryside views, urging family members to take the next train. He was not following the machine, he was running it. When Germany surrendered in 1945, Eichmann was caught by American forces using a fake name. He walked off a work crew in early 1946 as his former colleagues were naming him at Nuremberg. He moved to northern Germany, worked in forestry, leased a small plot of land, and waited. He was patient, methodical. He had spent his entire career thinking about logistics. By 1950, he was on a ship called the Giovanni C., sailing from Genoa to Buenos Aires under the name Riccardo Clement, carrying a Red Cross passport arranged through a network of church safe houses across northern Italy. The men who helped him were former SS, sympathetic clergy, and administrators who had kept their jobs after the war. The route was well worn. Hundreds of Nazi officials had used it before him. Argentina was not hiding him. Argentina was welcoming him. Under President Juan Perón, the country had actively recruited former Nazi officers for their technical skills. Pro-Nazi sentiment ran deep inside Argentine security forces. Eichmann was not an anomaly in Buenos Aires. He was part of a quiet community of men who had relocated, changed their names, and rebuilt their lives while the world looked elsewhere. He worked at a water company. He took odd jobs. He struggled with money for years. He was careful, low profile, and unremarkable on purpose. Then Mercedes-Benz hired him. By the late 1950s, Eichmann had risen to department head at the factory in Gonzales Catán, a working-class suburb west of the city. He built a small house at 14 Garibaldi Street in San Fernando, a rough neighborhood with unpaved roads and no running water when the family first moved in. He commuted by bus. He tended a garden. His neighbors knew him as a quiet German man who kept to himself. His wife and 3 sons lived with him. His sons used their real last name. Why would a man who changed every other detail about his identity allow his children to keep the one name that could expose him? No one has a clean answer. What is known is that his eldest son, Klaus, was using that name openly in Buenos Aires, including around people he had no reason to trust. In 1956, a 12-year-old named Sylvia Hermann met Klaus at a cinema. They began dating. Klaus visited the Hermann home regularly, never knowing the family was Jewish. At the dinner table, he spoke openly about his father, his SS rank, what the regime had accomplished, what it had failed to finish. Sylvia went home and told her father everything. Lothar Hermann had been blinded by Gestapo beatings at Dachau in 1935. He had no intelligence contacts, no money, no government backing. What he had was the name Eichmann, old newspaper clippings from the Nuremberg trials, and a suspicion he refused to let go. He sent letters to Jewish organizations in Buenos Aires. No response. He contacted a private investigator in Israel. The Israeli government shut down the contact. He kept writing. On September 17, 1957, he wrote to Fritz Bauer, the chief prosecutor of Hesse in West Germany, who was quietly pushing war crimes cases through a legal system that largely wanted to move on. Bauer read the letter. He understood immediately that if he filed it through official German channels, it would never reach a courtroom. The West German intelligence service already had a file card with Eichmann's Argentine alias. They had shared it with the CIA. Neither had acted. Both were protecting powerful men inside the new German government who had Nazi pasts they needed kept quiet. So Bauer went around everyone. He passed the intelligence directly to the Mossad. What happens when the only institution willing to act is one with no legal authority to make an arrest? The Mossad moved carefully. A surveillance officer named Zvi Aharoni traveled to Buenos Aires in late 1959. He had one key tool, the SS portrait photograph sourced by a Nazi crimes investigator named Manis Diamant. Aharoni spent weeks watching the man at 14 Garibaldi Street from a distance, taking photographs with a long lens. He compared the curve of the man's ears, the line of his jaw, the shape of his brow to the wartime portrait. He filed his report. Ricardo Clement was Adolf Eichmann. Mossad director Isser Harel flew to Buenos Aires personally to run the operation from the ground. He assembled a team of 11 volunteers. Nearly all of them had lost family in the Holocaust. One had survived Auschwitz. Harel sent their equipment in advance, split across parcels mailed to 4 separate addresses through 3 different airlines: handcuffs, fake license plates, a portable document forging kit, lockpicks, communication devices, cosmetic disguises, nothing that could link back to Israel if intercepted. The team rented safe houses, studied Eichmann's daily routine for weeks, and mapped every variable. They knew what bus he took. They knew what time he got off. They knew exactly how far he had to walk from the stop to his front door. On May 11, 1960, 2 cars positioned along Garibaldi Street after dark. One sat with its hood raised, engine trouble, nothing unusual. The second waited further down the road. At 8:05 p.m., Eichmann stepped off the bus. As he passed the stationary car, Agent Peter Malkin stepped out, took him to the ground, and had him in the back seat before a sound escaped. The whole thing was over in under 60 seconds. Eichmann was held in a rented villa for 9 days, shackled to a bed, questioned through the night. He confirmed his identity. He signed a paper agreeing to stand trial in Israel. On May 20th, the team sedated him, dressed him in an El Al pilot's uniform, and walked him through Buenos Aires airport customs using the passport of a real crew member who had been quietly admitted to a local hospital after a staged car accident. The border guards cleared the party. The plane took off that night. Eichmann landed in Israel 2 days later. At trial, he sat in a bulletproof glass booth and told the court he was a small man following orders, a mid-level administrator, a cog. He said he bore no personal guilt because he had never killed anyone with his own hands. The court convicted him on all 15 counts. He was hanged on June 1st, 1962. Hannah Arendt sat in that courtroom for months and watched him. What she saw was not a monster. She saw a man who had swapped conscience for procedure, human judgment for job performance. She called it the banality of evil. Not because what he did was ordinary, but because the system that let him do it was offices, schedules, paperwork, the same structures that exist in every government on Earth. The most frightening thing Eichmann showed the world was not what one man could organize. It was how little a system has to try once it has already decided not to see.